The wilderness stretched for miles, an untamed world where the trees whispered secrets to the wind and the rivers carved their way through valleys untouched by time. Here, in this remote expanse, nature was both beautiful and unforgiving. The towering pines swayed with the gusts of cold mountain air, their ancient trunks standing as silent sentinels in the ever-changing seasons. In the distance, the low growl of thunder rolled across the sky, a warning of the coming storm. Isolated from civilization, nestled deep in the wild, stood a small wooden cabin, built by hands that had long since given up on the world beyond the trees. Inside lived a woman who had chosen solitude over society. She had come here years ago seeking escape, finding comfort in the quiet that only nature could provide. The wilderness had become her refuge, a place where she could forget the pain of the life she had left behind. She had once lived in the city, surrounded by the hum of people, the endless noise of life pressing against her. But loss had changed her. A death, a betrayal, a grief so heavy it had driven her far from the world she once knew. Out here among the trees, she had found peace in the presence of animals, creatures who did not ask questions, did not judge, did not remind her of all she had lost. She had learned to live alone, to survive with only the land as her companion, until the day she found him. She had been walking the familiar trail near the river, her boots crunching against the frostbitten leaves, when she noticed something out of place. A figure, large and unmoving, slumped near the base of an old cedar tree. At first, she thought it was just a shadow, another fallen log in the endless sprawl of the forest. But as she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. A grizzly bear, but not just any bear. He was massive, his body a mountain of muscle and fur, or at least he had once been. Now his form was sunken, his ribs pressing against his matted coat. His fur was filthy, tangled with dirt and dried blood. His eyes, once the fierce gold of a king of the wild, were clouded with pain, half-lidded as if he had already accepted the fate waiting for him. The woman froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the rules of the wild: never approach a wounded predator. A bear, even a weakened one, was still dangerous. Instincts told her to turn back, to leave before he noticed her presence. But then she saw the scars. Deep, jagged lines ran across his body, old wounds healed over with twisted flesh. Burns marred his fur, the cruel marks of metal pressed into his skin. Chains had once been wrapped around his massive limbs, leaving permanent indentations in his flesh. This was no ordinary bear. He had been taken, tortured, used. She had seen animals like him before. Bears who had been stolen from the wild, forced into captivity, made to perform for humans. Some were paraded in roadside attractions, forced to dance on hot metal plates, their spirits broken. Others had been chained in backyards, trophies of people who had no right to own such creatures. And when they grew too weak, too old, too scarred to entertain, they were discarded. This bear had been left to die. A sick feeling twisted in her stomach. She had spent years avoiding people, but their cruelty still reached her in places they had never set foot. The bear stirred, his body trembling with the effort, his dull eyes flickering toward her. He did not snarl, did not move to attack. He simply watched her, too weak to do anything else. Something inside her broke. She knew she should leave. Walk away, let nature take its course. That was the way of the wild, only the strong survived. But the woman, despite all she had endured, could not ignore the pain in his eyes. He had suffered at the hands of men, the same men she had spent her life running from. And now he had been left to rot, discarded like something useless. She could not let that be the end of his story. Carefully she knelt, her breath steady despite the fear pressing at the edges of her mind. She reached into the pack slung over her shoulder, pulling out a small piece of dried meat, the kind she usually kept for the wolves that lingered at the edges of her cabin at night. Slowly she placed it on the ground between them, then backed away, giving him space. The bear did not move at first. He only stared, his breath slow and shallow. Then with a trembling effort, he lifted his massive paw, inching it forward, a silent acceptance. The woman sat back, watching as he took the first step toward trusting her. And in that moment, she made a choice. She would save him, no matter what it took. The woman's breath was steady, but her heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct, every bit of knowledge she had about the wild screamed at her to leave. This was a grizzly bear, one of the most powerful predators in North America. Even in his weakened state, he could kill her in seconds if fear or instinct took hold. And yet, she did not move. Something about this bear felt different. She had encountered bears before, healthy wild ones who kept their distance, only crossing paths with her when the seasons blurred their territories. They were cautious, indifferent, sometimes curious, but never broken like this. This bear wasn't just weak, he was something else entirely. He had known suffering, cruelty, pain, the deep scars on his body, the branding on his ear. He had come from captivity. She had heard the stories, read the reports of roadside zoos, circus animals, and rich men who took cubs as trophies, only to throw them away when they grew too strong, too wild, too much. The thought sickened her. She stayed crouched a safe distance away, her eyes locked onto his. He watched her too, his massive body trembling with every breath. But there was no rage in his golden eyes, only fear. That fear hit her harder than anything else. A grizzly bear should not fear a human. A wild bear would never flinch at the mere presence of a woman. But this one did. He had been trained to expect pain. Slowly she moved, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might startle him. She reached into her pack again and pulled out another small piece of dried meat, placing it on the ground between them. "Here," she murmured, barely above a whisper. She knew he wouldn't understand her words, but her voice, soft and steady, might keep him from retreating further. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but he did not react beyond that. His eyes flickered to the food, but he did not move. She waited. Minutes passed. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the distant calls of ravens circling above. The bear did not take the food. At first she thought it might be distrust, a fear that she would hurt him if he came too close. But then she noticed the slow rise and fall of his rib cage, the way his limbs barely twitched. He was too weak. A pang of sorrow settled in her chest. How long had it been since he had last eaten? Since he had known anything but suffering? The woman swallowed hard. She could not force him to eat, and she could not stay here forever. Reluctantly, she stood. "I'll be back," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for his sake or her own. She took a step back, then another, and finally turned, making her way toward her cabin. The bear did not move, did not watch her go. He simply lay there, fading with the daylight. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside her cabin, rattling the old wooden walls, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were back at the clearing, with the dying bear who had been robbed of his life before it had even truly begun. She had never been one to interfere with nature's ways. Predators hunted, prey ran, the strong survived. But this bear had not been given the chance to be strong. He had been beaten, locked away, starved. He was not dying because nature had deemed him unfit. He was dying because humans had taken his power away. That was what she couldn't accept. Sitting up in bed, she stared at the dying embers of her fireplace. Then a sound reached her ears, a howl. Low and distant at first, then another, closer this time. Wolves. Her blood turned to ice. She grabbed her coat, boots, and the rifle that leaned against the door. She had never needed to use it before, but she knew the rules of the wild. Wolves were opportunists. They would have smelled the bear's weakness, sensed the easy kill. They would not pass up a dying grizzly. She barely remembered the journey back to the clearing. The moment she reached it, she froze. The bear was still there, barely conscious. But just beyond the trees, a pair of yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. Then another, and another. The pack had arrived. A snarl broke through the night, followed by the crunch of paws against frost-covered earth. The wolves were moving in. The woman didn't think. She acted. She raised the rifle and fired into the air. The sound cracked through the silence, sending birds scattering from the trees. The wolves paused, their bodies tense, their eyes locked onto her. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out a flare. She struck it against the ground. A blaze of red light burst into the night, fire illuminating the trees like a burning sun. The wolves snarled, snapping at the ground. but they hesitated. The fire was something they did not understand, something unnatural. One by one, they retreated into the shadows, their shapes melting into the darkness until the night was silent once more. The woman exhaled sharply, lowering the flare. Her hands were shaking. Slowly, she turned to the bear. He had not moved. His body remained still, as if he had already resigned himself to death. But his eyes were open, and he was watching her. She took a slow step forward. The bear did not flinch. Another step. She knelt beside him, carefully placing another piece of food on the ground. This time he moved. Not much, just a twitch of his nose, a slow shifting of his massive paw. His golden eyes flickered to hers, searching for something he had never found before, a reason to trust. She sat beside him, keeping the fire between them, the light dancing in both their eyes. For the first time in years, the bear had been protected. For the first time in years, the woman had someone to protect. She knew in that moment that she couldn't leave him. Not now, not ever. She had found something worth saving. And so the woman and the grizzly sat together as the embers of the fire burned away the fear between them. The sun rose slowly over the wilderness, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The woman had not moved from her spot by the fire, nor had the bear. He remained curled near the tree, his massive body still, but his golden eyes open, watching. She could hardly believe it. He had stayed. Something had changed in him during the night. He had seen her stand between him and the wolves, had watched as she lit the fire and drove them away. She had protected him. And now, for the first time since she had found him, he did not look at her with fear. He looked at her with something else, a silent understanding. The woman knew she had to move carefully. Trust was fragile. It could take weeks to build and only seconds to break. She pulled another strip of dried meat from her pack and placed it a few feet from the bear. This time he did not ignore it. He didn't snatch it up either. He simply stared at it for a long moment before, slowly, he dragged his paw forward. His claws, cracked and dull from years of neglect, hooked the piece of food and pulled it toward him. The woman held her breath as she watched him sniff it. He hesitated, as if expecting some kind of trick. Then he ate. It wasn't much, just a few bites. But it was a start. For the next few days, the woman kept her distance, but returned with food and water. She did not try to touch him, did not try to force trust. She simply let him get used to her presence. And slowly the bear began to accept it. The way he watched her changed. The fear in his eyes faded, replaced by something softer. He no longer flinched when she moved, no longer tensed when she spoke. He still did not trust her, not completely, but he no longer saw her as a threat. He saw her as something else. Days turned into weeks. The bear, once too weak to move, began to regain his strength. His movements were still slow, his body still aching, but he no longer spent his days lying in the dirt, waiting to die. One morning, the woman awoke to find him standing. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched his massive frame rise, his muscles trembling under his weight. For the first time, he looked like a bear again. The grizzly took a few slow steps before collapsing back onto the ground, exhausted. But he had tried. That was enough. The woman smiled. She knew what this meant. He was choosing to live. One evening, as the fire crackled between them, the woman felt something shift. The bear, who had always kept a few feet between them, moved closer. Not much, just a foot or two. But it was enough. For the first time, she could hear his breath, see the texture of his fur up close. She noticed the patches of missing hair, the scars that ran deep beneath his thick coat. This was a creature who had suffered more than she could ever imagine. And yet, he was still here. She had spent years running from people, hiding from pain, believing that solitude was the only way to survive. But this bear, this broken, wounded thing, had let her in. Perhaps in some strange way, they were the same. One afternoon, as the woman was gathering firewood near the river, she heard a gunshot. Her stomach dropped. She turned, scanning the trees, her heart hammering in her chest. Then she saw the tracks. Boot prints. Someone had been here. Panic surged through her. A hunter, a poacher, someone who had no business in this part of the wilderness. And if they had seen the bear, if they knew he was weak, vulnerable, They would come back. She dropped everything and ran toward the clearing. When she reached it, she found the bear watching the trees, his body tense. He had heard it too. The woman moved to his side, her mind racing. She had to protect him. She had spent weeks helping him heal. She had fought off wolves, sat with him through the cold nights, watched as he slowly came back to life. She would not let someone take him away now. The bear, as if sensing her determination, did not run. For the first time since she had found him, he stood beside her. He was still weak, still wounded, but he was not broken. And for the first time, he was ready to fight. The air was thick with tension, the scent of pine and earth blending with something more primal, the scent of danger. The woman had been watching for hours. The small clearing in front of her cabin, usually quiet and peaceful, now felt like the edge of a battlefield. She had heard the twigs snap and seen the shadow move through the trees, the unmistakable signs of a hunter tracking something. Her heart raced as she clutched the rifle, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. They had found them. The hunter, a man she did not recognize, had crossed into her territory, looking for a prize. She had lived in these woods long enough to know when someone was hunting illegally. The cold gleam in his eyes, the quick practiced movements. He wasn't here to admire the beauty of the wilderness. He was here for the grizzly. And if he found him, if he saw the bear's weakness, the lion-sized predator would be just another trophy on the wall. She watched him from the shadows, trying to stay hidden, trying to make sense of what to do. She had already protected the bear once, fending off wolves and sending them into the night. But this man was different. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He was closing in on the grizzly, and in his eyes the woman could see the calculation. He had no mercy. The grizzly, sitting a short distance away, had not yet noticed the hunter's presence. He was still weak, his body no longer a powerful force of nature, but instead a shadow of the creature he once was. Yet his head was turned, his golden eyes scanning the forest for any movement, ears twitching. He sensed it. Even in his weakened state, the grizzly's instincts were sharp. The woman's breath caught as she saw the hunter take aim. His eyes narrowed, locking onto the grizzly. But the sight that stopped him was not the bear's size or strength. It was the bear's calmness toward her. The grizzly, once a fierce predator who would have never allowed a human to approach, now sat motionless, gazing at her with a silent, unspoken trust. The woman could see it. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't ready to fight. He was waiting for something. That hesitation, the strange bond between them, was all the hunter needed to see an opportunity. A weak, unthreatened grizzly. An easy kill. The woman's pulse quickened as she realized the gravity of the situation. The hunter was calculating. He was measuring the risk, and he had already decided that the grizzly's trust was his weakness. Should she stay hidden? Should she let him make his kill, knowing it could cost the bear his life? Or should she confront the hunter, risk everything she had worked for, to save the grizzly she had learned to love as a companion? Her mind raced, the decision weighing on her. If she revealed herself, there was no going back. There would be no more silence in the wilderness, no more quiet days by the fire. She would be seen as an enemy, a threat, and the hunter, a killer, would not hesitate to shoot her too, just as he had aimed for the bear. The woman, for all her solitude, had never imagined facing something like this. This wasn't a wild animal she could drive off with fire or words. This was a human, a force in his own right, and if she chose to stand, to fight for the bear, there was a very real chance she would lose everything, her home, her life, and the bond she had carefully built with the grizzly. But the bear was not just an animal now. He had become her friend. She had saved him. She had fought off wolves for him. She had cared for him, nursed him back to health after his painful past. And now she had to choose. Was she willing to lose it all to protect him? The answer came without hesitation. Yes. She rose from her crouch, moving slowly but deliberately. The rifle was heavy in her arms, but she did not flinch. She had lived too long in the wild to fear danger. What she feared now was the possibility of losing the very thing she had fought for, the grizzly's second chance. The grizzly's survival instincts screamed at him to run, to flee back into the forest, to escape the danger that had come too close. He could still run. Even in his weakened state, he was faster than the woman, faster than the hunter. He had always survived by running, by hiding, by escaping. But something stopped him. It wasn't the woman's voice, soft and steady as she called his name. It wasn't the rifle she held in her hands. It wasn't the logic of the situation. What held him in place, his claws digging into the earth, was a deep, primal bond, the trust he had begun to place in her. The woman had saved him. The hunter, for all his skill, for all his power, was just another human, just another enemy of nature. But this woman, she was different. She was not a threat. She was the one who had healed him, fed him, stood by his side when no one else would. For the first time in his life, the bear did not feel the need to run. He chose to stay. The hunter raised his rifle. He had seen the woman's movement. He had seen the look in the grizzly's eyes, a hesitation, and that hesitation was all he needed. With a quick, practiced motion, he aimed for the grizzly's chest. But just before the shot rang out, the woman's voice pierced the air. "No!" She moved fast, positioning herself between the hunter and the bear. Her voice was sharp, her words a command. But it wasn't just her words that stopped the hunter. It was the fire in her eyes, the force of her resolve that halted him. The hunter faltered, unsure of what to do. He had been prepared to kill the grizzly. But this woman, she was a force in her own right. In that moment, the bear made his choice. The sound of the shot still echoed in the air. The bullet grazed the bear's shoulder, leaving a deep wound. But he did not run. Instead, he let out a low, thunderous growl and took a step forward. He was weak, but the fire in his chest was still strong. He stood beside her, showing the hunter that he would not back down. The woman, seeing the bears stand, knew they had one last chance. She raised the rifle, not aiming at the bear, but at the hunter. She fired into the air, a warning shot, the crack of the rifle startling the hunter. The man hesitated, looking between the woman and the grizzly. But the woman did not lower her gun. She did not flinch. The grizzly, though wounded, was still standing beside her. Together they were a force, and the hunter knew it. With a final, frustrated growl, the hunter turned and retreated, knowing he was no match for the woman and the grizzly's unity. The hunter disappeared into the trees, his presence lost in the shadows. The woman lowered her rifle, her hands shaking with adrenaline. The bear stood still, his golden eyes watching her with a silent understanding. Though wounded, the grizzly stood by her side. He had chosen to fight. For the first time since she had found him, the woman felt that she was not alone. She had fought for him, and he had fought for her. Together they had survived, and together they would continue to survive. The wilderness had always been a place of survival. The strongest lived, the weakest perished. But today the rules of nature had been rewritten. It wasn't just the survival of the fittest that mattered. It was the bond between them that would determine whether they lived or died. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, the woman sat by the campfire, her eyes scanning the forest around her. She could feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The hunter had been driven off, but he would not be so easily deterred. She knew the man would come back. He believed that the grizzly was his, an object, a trophy, something to claim. To him, the bear was nothing more than a prize waiting to be taken. But to the woman, the bear had become something more. He was a companion, a creature who had chosen to stay, to fight alongside her in a world where she had once been alone. The crackling of the fire barely masked the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, the soft crunch of leaves beneath boots. The woman's pulse quickened as she saw the figure emerge from the trees. The hunter had returned. "You think you can just keep him?" The hunter's voice was cold, full of arrogance. His eyes locked onto the grizzly, who sat nearby, his body tense, but his posture still defiant. The grizzly had not moved since their last encounter, but the fear was gone now. Instead, there was a quiet resolve in his gaze. He had chosen to stand, and he would not run. The woman stood, her hand resting on the rifle at her side, her stance unwavering. "He doesn't belong to you," the hunter sneered. "I'll make sure he does." The grizzly's eyes flicked between the hunter and the woman. the tension in the air growing thick. The woman's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew that this was not just about saving the bear. It was about survival. The hunter took a step forward, but the woman raised her rifle, aiming not at him, but at the trees behind him. She had learned the landscape, had memorized every corner of her territory. The forest was her ally. Without warning, she fired a shot into the trees, the loud crack of the rifle echoing through the stillness of the night. The sound startled the hunter, and he instinctively turned, his eyes searching for the source of the noise. In that moment, she made her move. The woman dashed forward, moving with quick precision. The hunter's gaze shifted back to her, but it was too late. She had already taken a position that was hidden, and the hunter could not see her now. "Get back!" the hunter shouted, brandishing his rifle in a futile effort to intimidate her. But it was not him the grizzly was watching. It was her. She had outsmarted him, using the wild to her advantage. "This is my land," the hunter roared. "That bear is mine." The woman had made her stand. Now it was time for the bear to do the same. The hunter took a few cautious steps forward, his rifle still raised, but the grizzly did not retreat. The bear, though weak, was a force of nature, and he was not going to let the hunter take what was not his to claim. The grizzly growled, low and menacing, the sound reverberating through the trees. Despite his emaciated form, there was a deep, guttural power in his voice, a reminder that he was still a king of the wild. The hunter hesitated, his confidence faltering in the face of this raw, primal strength. The bear took a step forward, his body trembling from both exhaustion and the pain of his previous wounds. He was weak, but he was still a bear. He was still the wild. "Get back!" the hunter shouted again, aiming his rifle at the grizzly. But the bear did not flinch. Instead, he lunged forward with a speed and power that left the hunter no room to react. The woman watched as the grizzly's massive paw swiped through the air, knocking the rifle from the hunter's hands. The hunter stumbled backward, fear now replacing his arrogance. The bear's roar echoed through the forest, a challenge to the world itself. And yet, even with all the strength he had left, the grizzly's body was faltering. He was wounded, his energy spent. His fight was a desperate one. His instincts drove him to protect, to defend. But his body could no longer match the power of his will. The hunter scrambled to his feet, but the grizzly's movement had already thrown him off balance. He barely had time to react as the bear lunged again, knocking the hunter into the dirt. The woman stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle still raised, her heart racing. She had to end this now. She fired a warning shot into the air, and the grizzly backed off, his chest heaving. The hunter, sensing his defeat, scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "I'm leaving!" the hunter shouted, retreating into the trees. "This isn't over!" The woman didn't say a word. She just watched as the hunter fled, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The battle was won. The grizzly had saved her, but the victory came at a cost. The grizzly staggered, his body collapsing under the weight of his wounds. Blood dripped from his side, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The woman rushed to his side, her heart in her throat. She knelt beside him, carefully touching his fur, feeling the warmth of his body, but also the coldness that had begun to settle in. He had given everything to protect her, and now it was her turn to return the favor. As the night wore on, the woman stayed beside the grizzly. She couldn't leave him now. His breathing was shallow but steady. She had managed to stop the bleeding for now, using what she knew about herbal remedies from years spent in the wild. The fire crackled beside them, casting long shadows over the clearing. But as the woman sat there, watching over the grizzly, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the bond they had forged. The grizzly's body had been broken, scarred by years of abuse, but his spirit had remained strong. He had chosen to stay, and now she had chosen to stay with him, no longer as a stranger, but as someone who had come to understand that life in the wild was not just about surviving. It was about protecting those you cared for, no matter the cost. The grizzly's eyes flickered open, and for the first time since the battle, he looked at her with a calmness that spoke volumes. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew he would never speak the words. But somehow he understood. In that moment, she realized that she had come to the wilderness to be alone. But she had found something worth protecting. A companion, a friend, a family. and together they would face whatever came next. The days turned into weeks, and the woman's care for the grizzly had begun to show remarkable results. Though his body was still scarred and his movements stiff, the signs of life returned to him. His fur began to thicken again, the patches of skin that had been torn or burned slowly healing under her constant attention. His eyes, once dull and clouded, regained their sharpness, their gold flickering with the fire of a spirit that refused to be broken. The bear had not just survived the trauma. It seemed that in some ways he was beginning to thrive. The woman had never been more focused on something in her life than she was on caring for the grizzly. His recovery became her sole priority. Every morning, she would trek through the wilderness, searching for berries, roots, and herbs that could soothe his wounds and restore his strength. Every evening, she would sit beside him by the fire, talking to him softly in a language she didn't quite understand herself. But somehow it seemed to work. Each day, the grizzly became stronger, more alert, more alive. The healing process was slow, but every day brought with it small victories. The bear began to eat more, moving with more purpose. His once lifeless eyes now flickered with a quiet, cautious curiosity. Though still wary of sudden movements, the grizzly began to trust her completely. He no longer flinched when she came close. In fact, there were moments when she would catch him watching her from a distance, his eyes soft, almost grateful. It was a bond forged in the quiet hours of care and time. She had given him a second chance, and in return, he had begun to repay her with trust. They had both found something worth fighting for. The grizzly had come a long way since the day the woman had first found him. He was no longer the broken, emaciated creature he had been, the one who had barely clung to life, too weak to fight back or even trust. Now he was a mighty presence once again. His muscles had regained their tone, his stride confident, though not without the occasional stumble from the remnants of his injuries. But every day his movements grew steadier, more powerful. He was no longer just surviving. He was truly living once again. The woman would sit outside the cabin in the mornings, watching as the grizzly stretched and rolled in the sun, his massive form casting a shadow across the earth. For the first time in years, he was free. But as the grizzly healed, the woman could not shake the growing feeling of something else, something that would soon weigh heavily on her. She had become attached to him. She had not meant for this to happen. She had come to the wilderness to be alone, to escape the pain of her past. But in the process, she had found an unexpected companion, an animal who had been broken by human cruelty and who had, despite everything, learned to trust her. The bond between them had grown beyond what she had ever imagined. She had cared for him, healed him, and in return, he had shown her that even in the wild, there could be something more than survival. There could be love. But there was also a truth she could not ignore. The wild was not meant to be tamed. The grizzly had healed, but he was still a wild creature, a being whose heart belonged to the forest. He was not meant to stay in the safety of her cabin forever. The woman knew this, but the thought of losing him, of letting him go back into the wilderness without her, was a pain she had never anticipated. What if he didn't return? But even as the question swirled in her mind, she knew there was only one answer. The grizzly was meant for the wild. He had survived because of it, had healed because it had become a part of him again. She could not keep him chained to the life she had built for herself. The decision was made, but the moment she had feared finally came. One morning, as she stood by the cabin door, watching the sun break over the horizon, she turned to find the grizzly standing by the edge of the forest, his golden eyes fixed on her. He had come to say goodbye. The woman's heart clenched as she approached him, but she did not reach for him. She knew better now. She could not keep him in a world that was not his. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the silence stretching between them. No words were spoken. Then the grizzly took a step toward her, his massive head lowering, as though to acknowledge her. It was a thank you. The woman smiled through her tears. She didn't need to speak either. He had already given her everything she needed to know. With one last lingering look, the grizzly turned and slowly began to walk into the woods. His form, once broken and emaciated, now stood tall and powerful, a creature restored by time and care. As he disappeared into the trees, the woman's chest tightened, but she knew that this was the way of the wild. He had returned to his home, to the place he truly belonged. Days passed after the grizzly's departure, and the wilderness felt quieter somehow, emptier. The cabin was still, the forest silent in a way it had not been before. But as she sat by the fire, her thoughts wandered back to the time she had spent with him, the long nights they had shared, the moments of connection between two beings who had, at first glance, seemed so different. The woman had come to the wilderness to escape, to be alone with her grief. But in the grizzly's pain, in his fight for survival, she had found a kindred spirit. She had learned to love something beyond herself. And though she missed him, the wildness, the rawness of his presence, she knew that he had given her something more important than anything he could ever provide. He had shown her that even in the most broken of souls, there was a chance for healing. As she watched the flames flicker in the hearth, she understood. She had found her own strength in the process of healing him. And that strength was something that would stay with her, long after the grizzly had disappeared into the wild. In the end, the woman had come to the wilderness to be alone, but she had found a bond that would stay with her forever, a reminder that sometimes the wild gives more than it takes, and for that she would be forever grateful.